This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. There's been a lot of talk about the wildlife trade since the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic hit the global stage in early 2020. While much of the attention has been paid to locales overseas, the United States is also involved in the wildlife trade. In fact, more than $2 billion of items, that's over 400 million individual items, were imported to the United States in 2014 alone. Faunalytics, a nonprofit that conducts research and shares knowledge to help advocates help animals effectively, took 15 years of legal wildlife import data and analyzed it. The results are staggering. I was joined by Karol Orzechowski, Faunalytics Content Director, to discuss the Wildlife Trade Report, the Canadian connection, and what we can all do to make a difference. I thought the place to start with this one is to let's talk about what the wildlife trade is. When in this context of this interview, what we're looking at, because it's a very broad subject, and I think that's one of the things that comes across in the first paragraph of the special report you put together, is that it's just a giant subject.
It is a giant subject, and Faunalytics wanted to do something about this, partly because it's an important issue, and partly because the data was there. So what this data represents is a look at the legal U.S. wildlife import statistics. So let me break that down. It's looking very specifically at the legal trade of wildlife and wildlife parts, and it's looking at imports into the U.S. specifically. So it's not looking at, obviously, exports from the U.S. It's not looking at different countries trading with each other in that context. And it's specifically looking at the legal trade. So it's not looking at things like, poaching or black market trading of certain items, although that does factor into it a little bit. So to your question about, what exactly is the wildlife trade? Well, for all kinds of different reasons, people capture wildlife and either alive or dead and trade them amongst each other. It can be for fashion, it can be for meat, it can be for traditional medicines, it can be for simply just trinkets like shells and things like that. The scope of the way that people use wildlife is pretty broad, and that's something that we see in the data. We've got when you look at the different items that are traded, you've got everything from live specimens to jewelry to hair products to eggs to meat. You've got everything from ivory carvings to garments, leathers, trophies from trophy hunts, you name it, and it's probably part of the wildlife trade in some way, shape, or form.
It is pretty astounding to look at the data as well, and this is all laid out in, and this is one of my favorite things about Faunalytics and why I am a supporter myself, is not only does this outline everything, this wonderful report, and it feels weird calling it wonderful, but it is exceptionally well done. It's got all of the information, but then you also have these great graphics that help with scope, because I think that is one of the problems here when we're talking about this issue, is we're not talking about, someone sneaking in a little bit of stuff or not even sneaking, we're talking legal. So we're not, it's not a small volume of items going into the United States. We're looking at nearly like $1 billion per year at some points in imports.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And sometimes more. Oftentimes more than $1 billion in imports. We're talking about 3.2 billion live organisms over the course of 15 years. For animal advocates out there, 3.2 billion over 15 years, unfortunately, is actually on the lower end of, our exploitation of animals. When you look at,
Yeah.
animals used for food, it's, in some ways these numbers pale in comparison to other uses of animals, but at the same time, when you think about 3.2 billion organisms taken from the wild, over the course of 15 years, I mean, that's not insignificant. It's extremely high, and it sort of speaks to, yeah, like you're saying, the scope and the breadth of this issue.
And we'll get a little more into some of that. I think let's talk about, and I'm just looking at my question list because it is a morning and I'm only on my second coffee, but
No problem.
when you looked at this, so you said like we had the data, let's dig into it. Was there a hypothesis behind that, or was it very simply we have all of this information and this is a subject that has been talked about a great deal, largely as a result of a lot of the theories as to where the SARS-CoV-2 virus came from?
Right.
Was that part of the prompting for this, or was this a project already in the works?
It's interesting that you asked that, because it actually was a project that was already in the works. I believe it was already in the works before COVID sort of, came into public consciousness and became a thing. So this data is obviously, it's not data that Faunalytics collected. It's data that was collected by the U.S. Law Enforcement Management Information System, or LEMIS, and by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They are the folks who collect this data, and again, that's part of the reason why it's specifically looking at the legal trade, is that this is all data representing the wildlife trade that has been like legally declared. So the interesting thing about this is that this data has actually been available for, the past several years, and it's publicly available. This is not, this wasn't like investigative journalism. Nobody had to do any real sort of gumshoe digging into, where to find it or anything. This was publicly available data that is just part of a government data set. And is publicly reported. So, sorry, remind me of the second part of your question again.
Looking at, was there a question that you're trying to get at, or is there, a specific goal with the study?
So this would sort of broadly be classified for Faunalytics as an analysis only project. So what Faunalytics does is, Faunalytics does original research that the research department undertakes. And in those cases, there would be a hypothesis and pre-registration of the study, and gathering of data, and an analysis of the data afterwards. In this case, the data was already collected. We weren't, there wasn't a hypothesis set out at the outset to sort of guide the process, because we weren't part of the data gathering process. We simply took a data set that already existed, and the research department and a volunteer helped to process the data and analyze it. So there wasn't really anything that we were that Faunalytics was looking for specifically. We just wanted to know what the data actually said.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting because you start to see trends emerge, I guess, as you start putting it together. And what would you say are some of the key takeaways in that regard? Was there sort of things that, as you looked at this, you went, oh, this is going to be something we as advocates or as a society need to have some hard conversations about? Or is it more this is kind of what we were expecting and here's the information for everyone?
That is a very good question. I think, some of the things that were, I suppose, want to say surprising, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if any of it is super surprising. I think that
Yeah.
something that becomes really clear when you look at the data and graphs and the visual representations of things is that the vast majority of the wildlife trade is done for commercial purposes. It's done for and second a
Hmm.
close not even a close second after that is trophy hunting, and then there's a fraction of it that's used for personal use, scientific use, educational use. But the vast majority of it is commercial. The sort of second thing that's perhaps not surprising, but important to note, I guess, is that the the number of refused shipments. So when I say a refused shipment, I basically mean um, a shipment that was attempted to be declared as a legal shipment but was refused for not meeting criteria, legal criteria that would make it, legal to import. Uh, Refused shipments are extremely rare. We're talking, hovering between 1% to 2% a year, pretty consistently. No matter the volume of trade that's being done, those refused shipments kind of stay around the 1% to 2% mark. So what does that mean that only 1% to 2% of the wildlife trade is illegal? Absolutely not. All that means is that enforcement and um, enforcement is only catching about 1% to 2% of the illegal trade that's attempting to pass
Hmm.
as the legal trade. The rest of the illegal trade that's happening is really happening sort of in the shadow um, of this larger phenomena of the legal trade. And in fact, we don't really know if the legal trade is larger than the illegal trade, if they're the same size, or if the illegal trade is much bigger. We do know that the illegal trade exists, obviously, like poaching and those types of activities are, to greater or lesser degrees, pretty rampant in certain parts of the world, and uh, lots of species suffer because of it. So those are things that are kind of not necessarily surprising, I guess. When it comes to things that maybe are surprising, I think the scope of the trade is one. I mean, you can really find pretty much any
Mm.
pretty much any species, any taxa that's involved in this. I think something that might be surprising for people to know is the types of items. Top 10 in the top 10 items by strictly by number. You have live specimens, which are live animals, but something that's traded in an even higher proportion are shell products. So things like seashells and conchas and all these types of things that
Hmm.
would um, that would act as homes for wildlife, that might actually contain wildlife within them, that might be part of an animal's body. So that's something that I
Yep.
personally am surprised to see. I kind of had a sense that live specimens would be pretty broadly traded by number. Um, Correct. But when you look at, the analysis shows sort of top 10 items or top 15 sort of items by weight or by number. But there's so many more. I mean, we're just talking, again, it's just like almost any any possible sort of
Yep.
item or animal under the sun that you can think of has probably been imported or exported for for money as part of this trade.
Yeah, looking at that specific chart, it's overall import value by description on the page, which lays out, I believe it's 10 or 15, as you mentioned. And Shell is number one, a little over 2.2 billion line in terms of value import. And that one surprised me too. But as you were talking, I remembered as a kid going to Florida.
Sure.
And you go and you pick up seashells. And as a kid, of course, you have absolutely no idea that those seashells are on the beach because they also then go back out into the ocean and they may be homes for animals or they may be food for another animal. Very similar to the lessons I have learned much later in life about things like not taking things out of a forest because it's on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, a tree in a forest on the ground seems like nothing to us, but it is a mini ecosystem for potentially thousands of organisms. So that's an interesting one. The other thing that surprised me was trophy is all the way on the end. And I say all the way on the end. The dollar value is still almost 200 million, right? 178,501,524 dollars.
And I mean, I'm speculating a little bit here, but I would speculate that the low value of trophy imports is partly to do with the proportion of them that are brought in. I mean, you know, a lot of the items that are brought in are not necessarily for, you know, or as a result of trophy hunting, but I would guess that the low value is I mean, maybe this sounds like an odd comparison, but you know when you're sending something via post and you don't want to pay import duties or whatever, or you don't want someone else to have to pay import duties, you mark something as a gift, right? And these are items that are probably imported by the person that caught them, or by the person that killed the animal in question. And so, you know, like when we think about trophy hunting, it's important to think about who's doing the trophy hunting and who's getting the hunting trophies. I mean, it doesn't make much sense to display a hunting trophy that you didn't hunt yourself. And so I would imagine that the sort of low value of hunting trophies is due to two people sort of arbitrarily setting a low value on you know, on an item in question. But hunting trophies probably often include some of the more I guess you could say rare animals, or you know, sort of larger species, you know, that type of thing.
Well, and that's when we hear about people going and hunting grizzlies and wanting to take the paws or the pelt or the head back, right? That's their trophy, and you can assign a value at the border to anything. Of course, if a Canadian Border Service Agency is listening, I would never do that, and it is illegal to do so.
Right.
I want to get into the countries of origin, so I've got two questions about that, but I was looking through the ports of entry again, and I found this odd. So ports of entry in the U.S., the top 5 are exactly what you expect. L.A., New York, Miami, Newark, and San Fran, which is all traditional port cities. Then you go through Chicago, Dallas, Louisville, Kentucky, Anchorage, Alaska, Houston, Texas, big cities, and other common areas people come in. But right near the bottom of the list is Pembina, North Dakota, which has about 500 people in it. And I got to ask, how do they land in this top ports of entry?
I mean, that's a good question, and I wish I could answer it for you. Unfortunately, the you know, the data itself is not that granular. The data tells us what happened, why, or why, you know, why, like you said, like it's very easy to look at the sort of top 10 cities and go, okay, yeah, they're all coastal or sort of coastal, or they have a big, you know, they have big airports, or, you know, they're kind of travel hubs or that sort of thing. A place like Pembina, North Dakota, it's a good question. I mean, at that, you know, it's 1.7% of the imports, or it represents 1.7% of the imports. All of the other ones combined after that only represent, you know, 16% of the imports. So, I mean, I don't want to dismiss it as being too marginal. I mean, when we're talking about billions of items and species, billions of items and specimens, 1.7% is still significant. But unfortunately, I couldn't tell you why that specific city.
It feels like a short story waiting to be written, I guess.
For sure. And I think if we had sort of busted out the rest of that final one, all other ports of entry, I'm sure you'd see some really odd places as well.
Yeah, it's one of those moments where it gets to be a little fun to speculate, but apparently we're not allowed to do that.
I mean, you can, but it's speculation. So.
Yes, we looked down on it when I was in the news industry. You can't just say on the front page, "I think Justin Trudeau doesn't know what he's doing."
Right.
They frown on that as a news writer. Don't know why. Apparently now you can, but
right.
Looking at the top 10 countries of origin, so there's two parts here I want to talk about, and one requires a preface. A lot of these nations are Southeast Asia, and you will identify, and I think many of our listeners will identify, when we talk about this, on social media, I can say for certain, we see a lot of xenophobia and racism emerge.
Sure.
So I want to sort of preface by saying we can't judge a nation's people based on where wildlife comes from in terms of this, and that we are looking at some of this at a policy level.
Sure.
And while there are a lot of people involved and there's a lot of questions about that, it is a very deep contextual issue in a faraway place that we are not a part of.
Sure. And I think it's worth noting too that, again, this analysis is very limited in scope. We're looking at the legal wildlife trade, imports into the U.S. only, but when we think about the wildlife trade, it's important to think about it in terms of a global scope, and to keep in mind that the U.S. doesn't merely import wildlife and wildlife parts; it also exports wildlife and wildlife parts. China also has a top 10 list of countries who are the biggest importers China also has a top 10 countries of origin for wildlife parts that are imported into its borders. And when you're looking at something from the perspective of one country like the US, like you said, it's important to contextualize it. And I think for all of us, it's important to keep in mind that these, each of these countries also imports items themselves. Every country on this list, exports and imports wildlife items, and it's all a web. And, it's something that might seem, part of what we're talking about with the wildlife trade are quote unquote like exotic species. And so what is exotic in the US? Well, I would imagine that, animals and parts from Africa, Asia, Australia, those would be considered exotic in the US. Well, what would be considered exotic in China? Well, probably animals from Europe and animals from South America and North America. This is, what we're looking at here really represents the wildlife trade from the position of one country. It doesn't represent the wildlife trade overall globally, if that makes sense.
It does, and it's very well said. Thank you. I always stumble through that kind of stuff because it makes sense to me, but I don't always know how to express it.
Right.
And as I said, I think it's just sometimes it's a matter of language. We don't understand the language we're using can be problematic for others. So it's going into it with some compassion and empathy and understanding that we are a part of this, and that we are a part of this. Canada's on that top 10 countries of origin list for exports to or imports of wildlife and wildlife specimens to the United States, which realistically shouldn't be surprising. We are one of the largest trading partners of the United States, and they are our largest trading partner, I believe. what's coming from Canada into the U.S. And I'm going to try and look at that number. We're looking at 273 million. Is that, I don't know if that's value or volume though.
That's volume.
Okay.
So again, unfortunately, with a data set like this, we get we get a sort of overview and descriptive. Uh, we get the ability to sort of describe the wildlife trade in sort of quantitative terms, but we don't necessarily always get all of the dots connected for us as to why something is a particular way. So to your question about what exactly is being imported from Canada, well, unfortunately they didn't do that sort of cross tabulation, and they didn't that data isn't sort of cross listed that way. That being said, like you said, Canada, the U.S. and Canadian economies are pretty inextricably linked in many different ways. I mean, they're easily our largest trading partner. Or I mean, I'm no economist, but I would assume they're easily our largest trading partner. Probably both in terms of volume and value. And for them, I mean, we may not be their largest trading partner, but our proximity to them, I think, allows for a lot of sort of fluid trade to happen. Also because we sort of share a continental landmass, I think that the laws around importing certain species or perhaps certain types of meat and that type of thing are maybe a little less stringent perhaps than importing meat from, say, I don't know, like Southeast Asia or something like that. Canada is a hotspot for trophy hunting. We know that from other analysis. Faunalytics, Casey Bond dug up an analysis from 2019 that showed that Canada exported the largest number of legal trophies and trophy parts to the U.S., mostly black and brown bears. So there are a lot of sort of sensible reasons why we appear on that list, even if we're sort of down towards the at the bottom of the top 10. That's still, I mean, still being in the top 10 is significant, because across the 15 years that the data represents, imports came from over 250 different countries. So being in the top 10, even at the bottom of the top 10, is pretty significant.
Absolutely. And again, I think it speaks to when we talk about some of these issues and where the money is coming and going from. We know that a lot of Canadian outfitters target northern U.S. residents because if you can't hunt it there, come hunt it here, and vice versa.
Certainly.
For example, Canada lynx on either side of the border. You can trap it and it's protected. Right. And the only difference is an arbitrary line on a map somewhere. It's quite odd when you start looking at those things.
Yeah. And another thing the data doesn't really tell us is how much of this stuff is, Anchorage, Alaska is one of the, top ports of entry into the U.S. So obviously Alaska is not part of the sort of contiguous U.S. And we don't know how much of this stuff is sort of crossing the border in a particular way, possibly being, I don't want to say trafficked, because that specifically refers to the illegal trade, but we don't know how much of this stuff is being transported from, say, Alaska through Canada and eventually to the US. But I think we can assume that that's happening to a certain degree. And like you mentioned, these are to a certain degree sort of arbitrary lines on a map. And although, each country has its own laws, there's a lot of fluidity between the two, and a lot of fluidity in terms of in just in terms of this type of trade in general.
Yeah, and it's just another sign of how wonderful globalism can be.
Exactly.
I wanted to touch on, and we don't need to go in depth on it. This is something I personally find fascinating, and I rather darkly enjoyed writing about as a reporter was the organized crime aspect. So organized crime likely isn't all that involved in the legal form, but it is most, I would imagine, most certainly linked to it
Mm-hmm.
as part of the illegal trade. You know, the two are never all that far apart.
Yep.
Again, when we talk about organized crime, you mentioned earlier, we don't know how big the illegal wildlife trade is. Does that speak to the efficacy of the organized cartels of the world being able to move these things? Or does it speak also to corruption?
I mean, it speaks to both, and I should sort of walk that back a little bit. It's not that we don't know how big the the illegal trade is. We do have some sense of it, and there are, different government agencies and different NGOs around the world who are tracking the illegal trade. I would say, however, though, that we don't know exactly how big it is. We have some sort of estimates, and of course, as you mentioned, we know that organized crime is involved in this. I mean, you can't trade illegal wildlife in the volume that they're being traded without, without an organized crime element to it. When you're talking about shipping things across, around the world, it's just not being done by individual smugglers on an individual basis. These are, the trade is just too big to be all just atomized individuals that are doing it of their own volition. And especially when you're talking about the kind of money that's involved. When you look at the value of the legal trade, I mean, you're talking in the billions of dollars a year. The illegal trade is probably more lucrative by some order of magnitude, and the reason for that is because the items are more rare, or they're I mean, it's sort of baked right into the trade itself. I mean, these are, when you're talking about trading, for example, rhino horns, well, rhino horns are highly sought after and very rare and illegal. And so that's a sort of trifecta of factors that makes the price and the potential payoff for participating in the illegal trade really high compared to, say, importing a ton of shells or whatever. I think in some ways, whenever you have a black market like that, it's sort of inevitable for organized crime to be involved. I would say that corruption, I mean, plays a big role. Like the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime released a report in 2020 looking specifically at traffic in protected species, and that's very different from what the Faunalytics analysis looked at. Again, we looked specifically at the legal trade, but the things that they found really very much underscore the sort of the size and scale of the illegal trade, the amount, the kind of mind-boggling logistics and networks that are involved, and that these types of networks and logistics can't really exist entirely out of the view of government. Part of the reason that they exist is because of government corruption, and because in many places, people make very little money. Even government employees or military employees might make a fraction of the wage that we might think is appropriate, say, in North America. And that's another sort of way
Yep.
to contextualize um, who participates in the illegal wildlife trade and who doesn't. As we were saying before, it's very easy for us to look at, say, Asia or Southeast Asia and say, well, that's where all of the illegal wildlife is coming from. They must be barbaric or, something like that. And, when you're talking about making money and uh, trying to raise your um, quality of life past a certain point of poverty, I mean, people will do almost anything. And I truly believe that many of the people involved in the wildlife trade up and down, they don't do it because they hate animals or they're they're somehow barbaric or whatever other word people want to use to describe it. It's quite simply very lucrative, and that's it's that level of income that you get from participating in something like that is probably far out of the reach of a lot of people along that chain. And um I think that, again, like in North America, these things, it's not that there's no government corruption here or corruption of you know U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and yeah, I have no doubt that there are bad apples among all of it, and it doesn't take too many bad apples to really
Hmm.
to allow the illegal trade to keep going. I don't think it's that, for example, the entire Chinese government is corrupt, and that's why they're such a big um, source of illegal wildlife species and parts for the rest of the world. Um, it doesn't take the whole government to be corrupt for that type of thing to flourish. It just takes the right people in the right positions along the chain to help keep it happening.
Yep. And the folks who are involved in organized crime are very, very skilled at identifying and working those individuals, either through threats or money or power or whatever they may be looking for. And to your point, when we look at most crime from a sociological point of view,
Mhm.
we can see social issues behind it. Again, that's where we speak to context and empathy and understanding. There is a lot more going on in people's lives than sometimes we get from headlines.
Certainly.
And speaking of Asia and this whole concept, you end the report talking about I like it, it's the pandemic asterisk in future directions. But you speak to wet markets, and that is something we all talked about
Mhm.
very obviously, and some folks are still talking about very, very directly as the origin of COVID, and we must stop them because it's the reason that we're here. And I think your report very graciously points out that, yes, that's a possibility, but that's not the only possibility. And it's certainly not the only close call or actual pandemic we have seen come from animal agriculture, not just wet markets.
Certainly. And it's, I mean, for better or worse, and I think in many ways worse, the pandemic really underscored the link between consuming animals and zoonotic diseases.
Hmm.
um, Unfortunately, because of the particular socio-political dynamics of where it came from and how it happened, and this sort of even just the name wet market is kind of a problematic idea. um
Hmm.
we've certainly encountered a situation, I think, where animal advocates are really are really struggling to figure out a way to talk about this that isn't going to demonize a particular culture or a particular place. I mean, well, I should say, I mean, some animal advocates are trying to do that. Other animal advocates have gone fully into, racist mode and are happily trying to point fingers in a particular direction and not really taking stock of the fact that, I mean, the U.S. has some of the biggest factory farms on the planet, and each of those could be an incubator for zoonotic diseases at any given time. So it's it's important to talk about the origins of COVID-19. I think that for our part, or for Faunalytics part, we have tried to present a sort of nuanced view of this, but it's difficult. It's a difficult thing to navigate in advocacy, as so many advocates are really trying to take this as an opportunity to make change for animals. I think advocates need to ask themselves if they're making a positive change for animals at the expense of someone else. And although I'm sure a lot of animal advocates would be fine with that exchange, I think it's important for us to try and think about these things in a more nuanced way and be able to talk about the issue in more contextual terms, and to locate ourselves within it, not just point fingers at it as if it's an outside phenomenon.
Absolutely. And just to your point too, in terms of talking about consumption, and you will have better data than I, but the most recent one I could look up very quickly on the internet showed the U.S. meat consumption per capita it looks to be easily the highest in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And with that volume of meat consumption, and again, we won't go into a big tangent about this, but Faunalytics will have some of this data, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
With that meat consumption comes the requirement for factory farming,
Mm-hmm.
which then increases animal density, decreases husbandry, and all of those other practices, and becomes the ideal incubator for a virus to spread and grow. Like as a reporter, I covered H1N1, H2N5, West Nile virus, and another one that I can't remember right now, long before SARS even broke the news, and then this coronavirus. And most of these communicable diseases that are out there that are devastating economies and people come from wildlife or domesticated animals that we farm.
Yeah.
So I think, if we're going to try and point fingers, maybe we point at the people ordering rather than the people doing the preparing.
Mm-hmm.
But that's, again, a large conversation with lots of philosophy and ethics behind it. And not what we're getting into, but Faunalytics does have a lot of really good information on that for folks who are looking for more. I want to wrap up, though, with this. What can people do? Because it's a broad international issue. It feels overwhelming. How can I possibly do something about $2.2 billion worth of shells being imported to the United States? It feels insurmountable. So what can folks do who are concerned about this, who want to learn more and want to get involved?
Right. Well, that's always the sort of $1 million question, right? Is what can individual advocates do, and what can groups of advocates do together? I think obviously for a lot of animal advocates out there who may already be vegan or vegetarian, who may not purchase or consume animal products, you're already doing something by continuing to not consume or purchase those products. There are always sort of individual actions you can do, no matter how big or small these things, do make some impact. So, um, you know, I think you could look at any of the items on the list, for example, skins or shells or meats or anything like that, and think of ways that you can personally, individually get involved, whether it's you know campaigning to have certain exotic meats banned from your state or from your province, whether it's you know doing public awareness campaigns to raise awareness about the damage caused by removing shells from their natural environments. There's all kinds of things that individuals can do on that sort of personal level, depending on your. I mean, I feel like everybody's energy is tapped right now, and people are really sort of struggling with these, not just with, I mean, not just with these issues, but with day to day life.
Yep.
And then I think it's important to pressure government pressure, um, put pressure publicly on governments to start to move laws in a more humane and compassionate direction, where you know um, things like trophy hunting might be made to be illegal. There are
Hmm.
all kinds of ways that people can get involved, and for me personally, I tend to always um, tell people that the best thing that you can do to get involved is to identify the thing that you're passionate about and that you feel like you can sustain. So if you feel very strongly about wildlife issues, then there's a whole range of sort of action items that you can pick up from this. It gives you a sense of the places uh, where items are imported into. It gives you a sense of the value, the dollar value of different items, if you're interested in kind of doing a calculation of what would have the biggest financial impact on the industry. There's a lot here to dig into if wildlife issues are something that you're passionate about. That being said, like you said, a lot of this stuff um, is out of our hands. It's difficult, and it's difficult for us to have an impact, and that's always something that is hard for advocates to wrap their minds around. I think you can see it in other issues as well, like say with the research animal industry. It's very difficult for
Hmm.
individual animal advocates to have an impact there because a lot of it is government mandated or that sort of thing. So with any animal issue, I think it's important to do some research and sort of identify the leverage points. I think in the case of the wildlife trade, those
Yep.
leverage points really are commercial establishments that sell these types of, whether it's live animals or parts or whatever. It's important to identify the commercial entities that sell this stuff, that import this stuff, and then it's important to uh, leverage whatever energy we can towards the government, the government of the particular country in question, whether it's, if you're a US citizen, the US government, or if you're a Canadian citizen, the Canadian government, to, to make changes to what is allowed. Um, as we've been sort of talking about throughout the hour, um, getting rid of the legal trade won't necessarily mean that the illegal trade disappears. But I think the harder we can make it uh, for the legal wildlife trade to happen, I think it makes it, at the risk of driving things underground, I think it makes it um, a little bit better for animals to have less of this legal trade going on.
I think that would also make it easier to call out when we see it,
Right.
right? Like if we accept that this isn't okay, When we do see something, it's a little easier to go, hey, how'd that get here? And I'm going to echo again what you said, though, about if you're vegetarian or vegan, you're already making a daily impact. And I can say, and you may have felt this way as well, as someone who works on these issues every day. I was having a chat with a friend yesterday on a lovely walk in Hamilton, and they mentioned, hey, I've been feeling a little weird about this, and I was talking to my partner about maybe having a little less meat in our diet. And I said, yeah, you know what? That sounds great. If you want some recipes, let me know. I can come bring some food for you. We'll go out and introduce you to some stuff. And with all of the other things I do, I feel sometimes that is my most effective way to make change, because it's a very literal, direct,
certainly,
right? We can measure that and we know it's having a positive impact. And if everybody does a little bit of that, it goes an awful long way real quick. Of course, the other thing that we need is if you live in Pembina, North Dakota, to ask some questions and get back to us. There's a mystery there waiting to be uncovered.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think you're right. People on an individual level, the change that people are able to make can feel very small and limited, but I think we've seen, especially over the last like 4 or 5 years, animal advocacy really gaining a lot of momentum. Veganism and vegetarianism a lot more in the news, and people are becoming more aware that the impact, the impact of their consumer choices is having on animals. So I think we are seeing I think we are seeing some watershed moments happening. I know that it feels slow, like, similar to, say, the environmental movement. There's a lot of focus on climate change, and we're in this situation where it feels like the changes that we should have made should have happened 10 years ago, but we live in the here and now. And so, any changes that we can make and any actions that we can do from this point forward, will help to add a drop in the bucket. And I think it takes a lot of individuals, a lot of groups to work individually and together to make a change.
You can check out the Wildlife Trade Report at faunalytics.org. I also recommend following Faunalytics on social media for great advocacy tools, posts, and shareables. I want to thank Karol for sharing his time with me, and all of you for listening. I hope you'll follow me on social as well, at Howie Michael on Instagram and the Defender Radio Facebook page. Make sure you're also tracking the Fur Bears on Insta, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest updates, action alerts, and more. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio, reminding you to be kind and to stay informed and stay strong.